So I was listening to a 90s playlist while I was getting ready, trying to get some nostalgic vibes going, and somehow I have ended up retreating back to my 2005 rave era self. So you're just going to have to deal with the rave moth talking to you. But anyway, what I wanted to talk about, I think everyone now is aware of the fact that there is this gigantic wave of strange misplaced nostalgia, as in nostalgia for times that you never personally experienced, going on with the kids of today. That every single music video you go on that came out prior to about 2008, there are endless comments from young kids going, "I'm only 12 but I love this, I really wish I wasn't born in this generation." And running parallel to this, I've also noticed recently that I haven't seen a subcultural teenager in the wild, as in not on the internet, literally out in the world. I haven't seen a subcultural teenager in years. And I'm an 85 baby, so I remember, I was a teenager in the late 90s. And I remember, even in my town, everywhere you went, you would see packs of goths. And I'm not just talking like a couple of kids in jeans and a band t-shirt with pink hair. I'm talking full-on trench coats, spiky collars, heavy, badly applied makeup, crimped hair, in packs. And if you went into the city, you would see skater kids, emo kids, goth kids. There were subcultural kids everywhere you go. And suddenly they've just disappeared in the last few years. You don't see them anywhere. Like, I live near to a high school, so I see the kids coming out pretty much every day. I haven't seen an alternative looking teenager in forever. And all of this has made me think a lot about why it is that the kids of today don't seem to have these solid subcultures like all the generations for many years have done, and B, why the kids of today have this weird nostalgia. So anyway, I have thought about this muchly, and I have 3.5 reasons as to why this generation FOMO thing is going on. So number one, when you look back at past generations that had really thriving youth subcultures, there's a really interesting pattern regarding what was going on with the age of the population at the time. So looking back at the last century and really history in general, the first generation, I think, that had a gigantic, explosive, amazing youth culture really was the 20s, the roaring 20s with the flappers. This, I think, was really the first time in our semi-recent history that youths were coming out and doing crazy things and having this mad subculture that frightened the old people. And when you look at that time period, what had happened just before the 20s? There had been World War I. So World War I had decimated the population. Therefore, just like with the baby boomers after World War II, there would have been a lot of babies being born. And by the end of the 20s, you would have a huge amount of young people, hence the flappers and the roaring 20s and all of this going on, because there was a very young population. But then, of course, World War II, young people all going off to war, not much happy, not much going on in terms of youth culture. But then the baby boomers explode onto the scene, another very young, vibrant population in the 1950s. And this is when you first see youth subculture kind of blowing up. There is this real fixation on young people. And I feel like the 50s was when that started, with all the songs about being at the high school prom and getting away with mischievous love trysts that your parents didn't know about, your parents being away for the weekend, having a party in the house. All of that, I feel like, really kicked off in the 50s because of the baby boomers, because there were so many young people, and that kept on rolling with the 60s, with all the hippies, the Beatles versus the Stones, mods and rockers and all of that, the 70s, punk, glam rock, disco, 80s you had goth going on, punk still going on, hair metal, grunge in the 90s, more goth. You had all of this because I feel like the population there was still a lot of young kids. The baby boomers were young, then the baby boomers had a lot of kids themselves, so that accounts for like 70s, 80s, 90s. And now we have pretty much worldwide a very, very top-heavy population. I saw something recently that said the median age of a person in London at round about the end of the 20th century, the median age of a person in London was 25. The median age of someone now in the UK is about 48, right? So in general, the population we have right now is pretty freaking ancient compared to what I feel it probably was in the baby boomer generation, and even in the 90s, that people are living longer, people are having less kids, therefore the kind of the general age of who's the heavy bit of the population, it's older now. There is less of a youth thing to be doing because there are too many old people making the world a boring place, basically, to sum it up. So moving on to point number 2, as to why the kids of today are fixated on the 90s and the early 2000s. And that is the fact, hear me out, but that is the fact that rock stars are never going to be as cool as they were in the 90s and before that. That's not because they're less cool now, it's because of the internet and social media. So basically, in the 90s, if you were into a band and you were obsessed with them and you wanted to know about them as people, you wanted to hear their interviews, hear their points of view, all the stuff that you do when you're really into a band, particularly when you're young, you'd want to hear their interviews, right? But you wouldn't. You would not hear their interviews. You very probably would not ever see their interviews. You would never see them talking as people. The only way you would see interviews with the bands you loved was in music magazines, and everyone is cooler in a music magazine. Music journalists, my god, they make people seem like these star god amazing people, no matter how awkward and uncool they actually are in real life. Music magazines, they write with such emotive language, they use such glamorizing prose. For example, I remember hearing Richie Edwards of the Manics described as a dark-eyed waif with translucent skin. This is how they describe people. They describe James Dean Bradfield singing as like a man screaming in a room with no oxygen. You know, this is the kind of language they use. Compare that to these days. You want to see a band's interview, you literally just watch their interview on YouTube. And a lot of interviewers are not good. I mean, I think we've all seen interviews with interviewers who are just awful. You know, they're just so awkward. They're so awkward with their pauses and their questions that no matter how cool the person they're sitting opposite is, it's just awkward. It's just cringe-tastic. But even if you've got a good interviewer, there are a lot of people in bands who actually are not super confident and super charismatic in person. I think a really good example of this is London After Midnight singer. I don't know his name, but when you see him on stage, like in his element, he's like this freaking rock god. Like, he's stunning, like face and body. He has the full package up there on stage and he's got a great voice and you think, wow, what a god. But then you see his interviews in person. I don't know if he has Asperger's or something, but he's the most awkward person I've ever seen. And suddenly all of that like powerful rock god charisma turns into this kind of awkward person, pops like a soap bubble. Same with the Manic Street Preachers. You know, Manic Street Preachers, you read their interviews, particularly talking about Nicky Wire here. Nicky Wire in interviews can come off as every bit as eloquent, every bit as kind of political, fierce, intelligent as Richie. But when you see their interviews in person, Nicky kind of comes off as this clinger on to Richie. He kind of just seems like he agrees with everything Richie says. He seems very tall, very gangly, very awkward. And you know, the sex appeal is gone. There are so many pitfalls for someone to fall into when it comes to an interview that is live and uncut, or, you know, videoed and uncut, whereas in a music magazine, it's polished, it sounds eloquent. The other thing is simply social media and overexposure. That yes, it's lovely having your idols on social media, being able to actually talk to them, like live stream with them, see them pretty much face to face. Oh my God. but it makes them so much less cool because they're human. You see pictures of them buying coffee, lying in bed, ranting about their day. They're suddenly human. When the thing that really makes a rock icon is holes in the story, it's mythology, it's fake news, basically. And the reason that the whole world is so freaking obsessed to this day with the whole Kurt Cobain, Courtney Love thing is because there are so many holes in the story, because there wasn't the technology at the time. If Kurt and Courtney had been in this modern era and they'd both had social media, both been whinging about each other on social media, the whole thing had been there, they'd been, like Snapchatting things, no one would be fascinated with them in what, like 2-3 generations time. No one. Because the whole thing with idolizing a rock star when you're a teenager is the daydream factor, that you want to be able to imagine them as whoever you want or need them to be, that you imagine them to be someone you'd want to hang out with, someone you'd want to date. You fill in the holes about them, you make them into this character. And that means that they can be this icon to you that you fall in love with. However, the fact is, everyone is flawed. No matter how cool someone seems on stage and in their lyrics, the fact is that if you know every single facet of their personality and their life, probably you're going to disagree with some things you say, you're going to find some of their pictures kind of ugly, you're going to not like some of their style choices, you're going to think they're a bit boring in person. They're going to be a real person with real flaws. Whereas if all you see of them is them up on a stage in their element, performing music, and then you get these polished, glamorized interviews and reviews in music magazines, and then you get myths and legends that you just hear at gigs and, you discuss with your friends, you can turn them into anyone and they can be your perfect person. You can idolize them. And I feel that's something that we've lost with rock stars being on social media. The other element to this is the fact that because of the way people get into the music industry now, that anyone can share their music. Anyone can just get a SoundCloud account or be on YouTube. Anyone can share their music. Rock stars and pop stars and music icons in general are getting younger and younger. Whereas, in the 90s, you had to be signed. You had to be a signed band, really, for anyone to hear your music. You couldn't share it any other way. You could be a local pub band, but no one falls in love with them, You basically had to be a signed artist, which would generally mean you would have had to be working in music for a while. You'd have to be out of school to have the time to do it. So most musicians were in their 20s, like Kurt Cobain, Richie Edwards, both of the times they kind of disappeared/died. They were 27. 27 in the 90s was like, oh my God, they were cut down in their youth. These days, Lil Peep was 21, 22 when he died. And I think the thing is, if you're like 14, 15 and your musical icons are only 17, they're going to feel a lot more relatable. I think definitely a lot more relatable, but you lose something in that when they feel like they could basically be you, and you're kind of inspired to start writing music too, because, hey, they're just like me, they're only like 2 years older than me, they're just like me. Whereas in the 90s, you were like 14, 15, like, fawning over someone who was about 23, they seemed a lot more worldly. They'd done a load of drugs, they'd gone to a load of parties, they'd had all this sex, they had this huge lifestyle that obviously, in the 90s, rock stars did have this huge lifestyle because the music industry was so much more lucrative than it is now. Before downloads and streaming and everything crippled the music industry, in the 90s rock stars were loaded. They had these huge crazy lives of excess. So when you were looking up to these like 23-year-olds, it was like, my God, they've seen so much, they've had such a life, and there would be way more of like an unequal footing. So you would look up to them, they would seem cooler. And then the final element to this, kind of bolting on from the fact that rock stars were older, this is probably going to bug some people, but older rock stars generally wrote better lyrics. There was more lyrical complexity. You look at songs by like Radiohead, Manic Street Preachers, Red Hot Chili Peppers, I don't really include Nirvana in the super complex lyrics thing, you know, honestly. His lyrics were a big splodgy porridge of nonsense to me. Some lovely phrases, but basically nonsense. Whereas, you know, the lyrics of this generation, like, teenagers are desperate to find lyrics that resonate with them. You know, you feel so alone and so alienated at that age. You want to have this lyric that someone else is singing that captures your soul. But unfortunately, teenagers are having to lump that onto lyrics that are just shit at the moment. You know, basically you can say anything in a song these days. So off the top of my head, you could say something like, anxiety really gets to me. I struggle with it every day. But hey, I got some Xanax bars, so I'm going to get through the night. You know, just gibberish you might write in a journal. Meaningless, oh, anxiety's really bad, oh, it's a bit difficult. You could say that teenagers are going to be quoting it everywhere, just like they quote things like, in high school I was a loser, I was a reject, I was a poser. Or, Zan's gonna fake you. Oh my God, they feel my soul. Whereas, you know, in the 90s, you had things like, despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage. I know I believe in nothing, but it is my nothing. Prejudice burns brighter when it's all we have to burn. You had these big statements. How many special people change? You had lyrics that were written by people who were just a bit more worldly and just had a bit more time to polish their craft, because I feel like that's why these songs have stood the test of time, whereas I don't think Zan's Gone Fake You is gonna stand the test of time in the same way, but that's a bit of a subjective point. So anyway, moving on to the final and probably the biggest and heaviest reason as to why kids today are wishing they weren't born in this generation, and also the reason I don't see any subcultural kids anywhere, and that, to state the bloody obvious, is the internet. Because when it comes to subcultures, when it comes to things like grunge and goth and punk and all of these things that the kids of today are pining for, they were subcultures, right? The mainstream cultures revolving around pop, they're always going to be there, because who's into them? It's the extroverts who've never really had a major awkward problem in life, because they're outgoing, they're socially fluent, they don't have a difficult time, so they like to listen to happy music. Mainstream culture is never going to die. The introverts, however, who create the subcultures, they're the misfits, they're the awkward ones. So oftentimes they're introverts, or they're people who just have problems making friends, and they're the ones who write the interesting lyrics, basically, because they're introspective and they're having problems, and dark lyrics are always way more interesting than that one about, put your hands up if you feel happy, do you feel happy? I feel happy, I feel like a house without a roof, I'm so happy. You know, the dark lyrics are always more interesting, but the awkward, introspective kids of today aren't forced out of the house by boredom, because the internet, you have everything you want. We have so much home entertainment that nothing better to do factor is not there. Whereas in the 90s, you would probably, I mean, you know, some of the 90s, there was no internet. But for my period of the 90s, there was internet, but it was basic, and also it was dial-up, which was expensive, which meant your parents would probably give you 1 hour a day of internet. Literally 1 hour a day of internet, and it was so slow loading that may as well have been 20 minutes in terms of what you would actually achieve. And then you had 4 channels on the TV, that was it. So even if you were an introvert and you were socially awkward as fuck, if there was anything going on in your town, you would go to it, because what the hell else have you got to do? What have you got to lose? You know, you're going to be sitting at home with your mum, watching the freaking news, or you can go out and see what happens, you know? The whole kind of Bruce Springsteen lyrics that I love so much about, you know, there's something happening somewhere, even if we're just dancing in the dark. That kind of thing. I love that lyric so much. But that kind of thing, you know, just being so bored that you think, I don't even care. There's got to be something happening. I don't even care what it is. I'm going out. I'm going to go and find something to do. And that was what built subcultures. That was what built all the cool times, was people being so fucking bored that they went out and made things. And now introverts don't have to. And I mean, this is a tangent, but I find it interesting that this is the generation that really goes on about anxiety. You know, the 90s depression was the thing that people went on about. You know, Prozac Nation, Girl Interrupted, Prozac becoming such a big thing. It was depression, whereas now anxiety is the thing that everyone talks about. You know, this anxiety epidemic, which is so weird considering the fact that introverts basically don't go out anymore. You know, they don't. They stay at home. And is that why teenagers are so anxious? Because they're not forced to practice and forced to gain social skills by just going out. You know, and in the 90s, it wasn't like you could even go out but not really be present, be just, you know, scrolling through Instagram. No, your cell phone at that point, if you had one at all, it had nothing to do on it. You didn't even have Snake at that point. There were no games on your phone. There was no internet. So you couldn't be in a bar like on your phone because there was nothing on it. You'd just be staring at a blank screen. You had to actually be present. You had to get up and, I mean, what I used to do, because I used to go out on my own, and that's something I want to make a video about at some point, is going out on your own and being okay doing it. But I used to as a teenager, and I would just get up and dance all night. Because no one can tell you're on your own when you're dancing, right? You could just be dancing. You can be the cool person who doesn't care that there's no one else around. You're just dancing and you're free and you're cool, and that's what everyone thinks if they see you dancing. Whereas if you're, you know, in a corner on your own going, you look super awkward, right? So you had to learn social skills no matter how awkward you were, whereas now people hide in the house. They, you know, it builds up, the anxiety builds up because there's no kind of aversion therapy, I feel like. But anyway, tangent. Yeah, basically the internet has kind of fucked it, because I feel like the cutoff point with subcultures and when everything really dropped dead, I feel like 2008 was about the last year that things were really good, which obviously that was the year of the economic crash. So there is that going into the fact that going out life is dead because, you know, people were broke, people didn't have the money to go out, bars were going bust because of that, there was less to do. But also that was round about the time that MySpace was kind of getting big but also falling into Facebook. Facebook was really blowing up round about 2008. Social media was becoming such a big thing, and streaming was becoming a big thing, BitTorrents and things. And suddenly we have the death of all subcultures. The biggest tragedy and the biggest irony, I feel like, these days, particularly when it comes to the goth scene, is that we have so many fabulous clothes available to us now compared to the crap that that I had to wear in the 90s, you know, wanting to feel like this swooping, imperious, you know, intimidating goth queen, and having to basically just wear like unfitting, shapeless, cheap velvet sacks. Whereas now you've got these truly godlike clothes that you can get anywhere on the internet. They're not even that expensive, really. And yet there's nowhere to freaking go and wear them. Like, you have all the things that you wanted, and yet in getting that, you've actually lost all the stuff that mattered. Yeah. Because as far as subcultures go for kids today, I feel like what is there really? I mean, there's the new branches of the queer community. There's, you know, the non-binary kids, the asexual kids, and I feel like that's not really something you can go out and be. It's not like something that brings people together in big groups. You know, most of those kids are too young to go to gay clubs and don't seem to be wanting to go to gay clubs. So it's very much like an online thing. It's like a Tumblr thing. You can be all over Tumblr, but honestly, I think if your main subculture is online, you just feel more alienated from the real world. Because think about things like this, that you describe yourself as an NB and an ace and an arrow, and these are the words that you have and that you bandy around with your friends, and they all make sense to you, and you have this language all of your own. But what does it do when you create a language all of your own? You try and speak it to anyone else in the world, they don't understand you. You immediately feel alienated, lost, isolated in the world. These people literally don't understand me. That's what happens when you really, you know, go in deep with an online world. Then obviously you've got the woke kids, you know, into their political movements and all of that. But again, I feel like it's just about making angry posts on Twitter. I don't feel like most of these kids go out and participate in political rallies, because this is the curse of this generation, is this safe space mentality, that if you talk about anything, you want to talk about it in a safe space with friends where everyone agrees with you. You don't want to actually go and take the fight to the people you need to persuade and have like, you know, opposition and confrontation. It's safe space culture. But that means you don't broaden your world. You don't make a subculture into something bigger, because, you know, subcultures probably started with like one band of friends in a bedroom going, hey, let's make a band. And it was them in their garage making a racket, and then they went to a pub and they played, and a few more people joined in, and they got a few fangirls, and, you know, and it got bigger, and then they got signed, and then they were on the world stage and people got into it. And, you know, all these subcultures, they start with a very small group of people going out, taking a risk and bringing their subculture to other people, which, you know, doesn't happen if all you do is talk about it online and all you do is talk about it with people who already agree with you. But that's a whole rant for another day. So anyway, tell me your thoughts. Are you one of this generation who feels there is nothing going on at the moment? This is a crap time to be young. Do you feel this way? Do you not feel this way? Are you a young person who actually feels like, hey, the world's great? There's Trump in power. There's terrifying abortion laws in America. There's Brexit. There are far right movements going on everywhere. But there's a lot of good stuff on Netflix. I don't get it. Yeah, I would find it hard, honestly, to feel like this was a great time to be young too, if it was me. But yes, do you have other reasons you think that are behind this? Is it the Illuminati? I don't know, you tell me. I'm going to shut up now, because this is a bit long, but I've enjoyed being a little rave moth with my very reflective... This is actually very, very 90s, possibly even 80s. This is actually a slap band. I think these have made a comeback, right? They were so cool, I loved these. It doesn't really work, but... yes, slap bands. Slap bands that give you an excuse to hit your friends and pretend you were just giving them a cool accessory. Anyway, shutting up now. This is a waffle. Tell me what you think. Bye bye.